The 60s and 70s were full of crazy ideas and the people who embraced them. Let's be grateful that we no longer have to eat Jell-O with floating tuna fish and so much more.
He may act like he wants a secretary, but most of the time they're looking for something between a mother and a waitress. And the rest of the time, well.
I know you're shocked that in the 60s and 70s, some male execs hired secretaries based on their looks, but Don Draper has nothing on the airlines. Modern flight attendants hate being called stewardesses, and for good reason. The word stewardess harkens back to a time where working long flights meant mostly looking foxy in a miniskirt. In those days, stewardesses had to be at least 20 years old, but no older than 27, well-proportioned, and weigh no more than 140 pounds. Also, you had to be at least 5'2", but no taller than 5'9", unmarried, and childless. In other words, you had to be hot and available.
Are you wearing your girdle?
Yes, ma'am. Oh.
Job training included lessons on how to walk sexy, how to stand sexy, and how to put on your makeup, and how to style your hair. And if you got freckled or tanned, or God forbid, got a bruise on your sexy legs, you could be suspended.
Stewardesses, like jetliners, must be slinky sex symbols. Pilots can be homely and bald.
Oh, and once you reached 32, you had to retire, because obviously. 1973's touted Battle of the Sexes was something of a rematch of the sexes, really.
There's a lot of men through the ages that you can admire. I haven't been able to find too many women.
The challenger, a male chauvinist former tennis champion named Bobby Riggs, had been braying about the unseriousness of women's sports and offered to square off against the best female tennis players. His call was first answered by the aptly named Margaret Court, who was the number 2 ranked women's tennis player in the world in 1972, and fresh off having a baby. Court accepted the challenge, the on-the-nose Mother's Day scheduling, and the roses Riggs handed her, then proceeded to lose the match. Fortunately for American women's tennis, Billie Jean King was ready to avenge Court's loss. King had a successful track record of agitating for better pay for female athletes, even getting Philip Morris to sponsor a rebel tournament for women who had walked out of an earlier competition that offered them a fraction of the men's payout.
He sold tickets to watch him hit balls at a poster of Billie Jean King.
King out-gimmicked Riggs at the rematch, arriving carried on a litter by 4 shirtless, well-built young men. King then walloped Riggs. Not only did she outplay him on the court, it was a very public whipping. 48 million Americans had tuned in to watch the match, and they saw King notch a decisive win for the ladies' side. Of course, there's a twist to all of this. There's always a twist. Riggs probably threw the match. He was a compulsive gambler, and there are indications that he put money on King. For her part, Billie Jean is adamant that Riggs didn't throw the match, but this much we know. The victory catapulted the women's lib movement worldwide. Remember way back when the good guys and the bad guys were as clear as crystal?
The mob is run by murdering, thieving, lying, cheating psychopaths. We work for the President of the United States of America.
Oh, that delicious irony. On June 17, 1972, 5 men were arrested for breaking into Democratic National Committee headquarters in Washington, D.C., located in the Watergate building complex. 4 of these men had ties to the U.S. Intelligence Service, and the 5th was an employee of an organization working to re-elect America's sweetheart, Richard Nixon.
It has created a crisis in the presidency, the likes of which this nation never before has seen.
Nixon and his allies attempted to muddy the waters around the incident, and Nixon even instructed the FBI to quash its inquiry. In November, Nixon was re-elected in an absolute romp, burying George McGovern in a 49-state landslide. Massachusetts and the District of Columbia alone voted against him. But journalists didn't let the Watergate thing go, and the subsequent trial of the men arrested at the break-in, along with the establishment of a Senate committee to investigate irregularities in the presidential campaign, fueled growing suspicions about Nixon's honesty.
The matter of Watergate indubitably has tarnished the prestige and put in question the credibility of the presidency of Richard Nixon.
Despite all the president's efforts to stop it, the scandal quickly snowballed, and by August 1974, facing almost certain impeachment, Nixon resigned. Vice President Gerald Ford took office and went on to pardon Nixon. That decision would crater Ford's popularity. He lost the presidency to Jimmy Carter in 1976. Watergate ultimately altered America's faith in the government forever.
But for a bungled burglary, we might have missed the level of corruption in government.
Say what you will about filling a mattress with water. It's a more appealing idea than some of the rejected concepts, which included cornstarch and gelatin as filler. The winning idea, using one of the most abundant substances on Earth instead of second-tier kitchen supplies, was presented as a master's thesis in design in 1968 by groovy entrepreneur to be Charlie Hall. Hall wasn't the first to have the idea, but he was the first to imply an ooh-la-la, slightly seasick sexiness that was key to the waterbed's marketing in the 70s. Soon, the waterbed was a bona fide craze, with sales roaring until the late 80s.
In my bedroom, I have a brass waterbed.
With a waterbed, you were always a puncture away from catastrophe, and filling them required a hose. They were heavy, hard to clean, and even harder to move. Whether people really enjoyed trying to sleep through life rafting like rolling or making whoopee while surfing tidal action is a question only those individuals can answer, but declining sales indicate that sooner or later the novelty wore off. One of the bigger problems, believe it or not, was temperature. Most of the later ones were heated, but without that, water could get pretty cold and uncomfortable. Perhaps the strangest obsession of the 60s had to do with Jell-O. First, a word about Jell-O. It's disgusting. Just take a step back for a moment and think about what Jell-O actually is. It's the processed, pulverized body parts of pork, cattle, and sometimes even Mr. Ed. And if that's not enough to put you off, it all adds up to jiggly goo with the flavor added later. To be fair, you throw in some rum in there and you have a delicious treat, but we don't advocate alcohol consumption. Just saying.
I hate Jell-O. Oh, come on, there's always room for Jell-O.
Back in the day, before holding fermented molasses, they mainly held anything but that. It could be vegetables and tuna fish in Jell-O. And if you don't believe people ate that, there was a real Jell-O ad captioned, "No lie, ring around the tuna," garnished with curly endive and radish roses.
Make a 20-pound gelatin filled with beef and marshmallows.
1960s housewives put just about everything into Jell-O. They were torn between convenience and the unthinkable possibility that someone might call them lazy if they served their family convenience food. Shaped Jell-O molds solved this problem because just about any food could be elegantly presented, including things like savory salads with fancy shrimp or mayo frosting. One popular cookbook from the early 60s included recipes for molded avocado and tuna and jellied veal loaf. It's okay if you need to barf.
I think you'd just feel better if you threw up. I don't have to throw up.
Polyester is the world's most popular synthetic fabric. It tends not to wrinkle and dries quickly. What's not to love? Well, plenty. It's often, though not always, made from petroleum, and its presence in many fabrics means the garments can't easily be recycled, which matters a whole lot more now. Additionally, clothing made with polyester sheds microfibers when washed, increasing the load of synthetic chemicals in the environment, and to make matters worse, they are often manufactured by people without serious workplace protections. Most of these worries were in the future for the fashionistas of the 70s, aka the polyester decade. The smooth feel of the fabric was perfect for the sexy, freewheeling vibe of the era, a sort of dressed-up descendant of the casual late 60s. Fabrics like polyester especially suited flowing 70s silhouettes, but most of the styles of the decade could be made with it. Moreover, polyester and its sister synthetic materials were cheap, making trendy clothes more affordable for more people, whose budgets could now stretch to include the more playful styles of the time.
This is our breakfast.
An orange wedge, 3 cashew nuts, and a solitary grape.
Sometimes I can't even finish all the grape.
Fad diets are generally not good for you, but some seem more fun than others. That's certainly the case for the wine and eggs diet, which promises over 5 pounds of weight loss after a few days of white wine and eggs for breakfast, white wine and eggs for lunch, and white wine and a little bit of steak for dinner. And black coffee if you like. The wine should be dry, ideally Chablis. And while it sounds like a fun day, the plan was supposed to be followed for 3, which veers close to Bender territory. The diet was published in 1962 by Helen Gurley Brown, who would go on to be the longtime editor of Cosmopolitan. It was reprinted in Vogue in 1977. A writer for The Kitchen tried the diet in 2022 and it had a brief viral resurrection, more as a meme than a genuine suggestion. She reported fatigue, mood swings, and a dislike of poached eggs, but also a 7.2-pound weight loss. So there's that, I guess. Once humans figured out how to refine sugar, there was no stopping us. Sugar is delicious, and things that are delicious deserve to be more delicious, like Jell-O shots, so bring on the added sugar.
We could do shots. Shots, 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 shots.
Heart disease was rare in middle-aged people up until the 1950s or so, when they suddenly started dropping like flies. At first, the blame fell to saturated fat. Then in 1972, John Yudkin published Pure White and Deadly, which sounds like it's about another white thing from the era, but is actually the definitive book on the evils of sugar. And the food industry went, "We have to shut this guy up quick." So they destroyed his reputation. Crisis averted. People went on believing eggs and other sources of saturated fat were the enemy, even though countries like France and West Germany had low rates of heart disease despite a steady diet of fatty foods.
No meat, no cheese, and no beer.
No beer?
Fortunately for the sugar industry, that was all the time they needed to get us all irreversibly addicted to sugar. It was once perfectly acceptable for banks to ask credit card applicants questions like, "Are you married?" or "Do you plan to have kids?" as long as the applicants were female. And if you weren't married, the bank expected you to bring a man to co-sign for you, because everyone knows women can't do math without a man's help, much less pay their own bills.
Oh, that's sarcasm, but I forgot to inflect. This sounds way more like sarcasm. Inflection is so interesting.
Banks could also give women lower credit limits compared to men, even if they earned the same salary, because obviously a woman hadn't yet been born who could control herself in a department store. It was the bank's responsibility to rein them in. In fact, it wasn't uncommon for a credit card to be issued to a woman under her last name with a Mrs. attached to it. Yes, believe it or not, a card would just say Mrs. last name, and that was perfectly fine to use at Caldor. In theory, these practices ended with the Equal Credit Opportunity Act of 1974, except it didn't really end because even as recently as 2012, researchers have found that women still pay more for credit cards than their male counterparts.
Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.
In 1964, 5 countries had nuclear weapons: the United States, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, France, and China. This seemed like enough nuclear power for a jittery world, so in 1968, these 5 countries signed a non-proliferation treaty aiming to limit the spread of nuclear capability around the world.
We are willing for the banning of all atomic tests if everybody else agrees to it.
India went ahead with a successful weapons test in 1974, disturbingly named Smiling Buddha. The Indian government claimed it was going to use nuclear explosives for projects like canal digging and mining, which would be, to put it bluntly, incredibly stupid. Fortunately for any civilians who had been drinking from these theoretical canals, it was also a transparent lie, and in subsequent decades, India has only increased its stores of nuclear weapons. Today, the world contains over 12,000 nukes spread across the 9 nuclear weapons states. Russia, heir to the Soviet arsenal, the United States, China, France, the UK, Israel, India, Pakistan, and North Korea. Technically, Israel has never admitted to having nukes, but no one is buying that. In 1994, Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan relinquished their Soviet-era nuclear weapons back to Russia, which was a tactical error given Russia's subsequent efforts to reacquire territory it lost in the breakup of the Soviet Union. We're not saying nukes are good, but they are a deterrent. In 1968, US and North Vietnamese forces met in Paris to begin looking for a way out of the seemingly endless Vietnam War. Unfortunately for many people on the ground, 1968 also saw the heaviest bombing raids to date. From the beginning of Richard Nixon's first term, he knew he needed a way out, but one that didn't make it look like the US was cutting bait and leaving South Vietnam to falter. His solution was to attack positions in Cambodia and Laos, which is not traditionally what ending a war looks like. Finally, in early 1973, US and North Vietnamese negotiators signed a complex but optimistic agreement under which the US would leave and North Vietnam pinky swore not to invade the South beyond what it already occupied. The hope, at least allegedly, was that South Vietnam could hold out long enough for everyone to save face. It didn't. The ceasefire called for in the Paris Agreement was violated by both North and South Vietnamese forces, leaving South Vietnam on the ropes. In early 1975, North Vietnamese planners began a proposed 2-year campaign to gobble up what remained of the South. For them, it was an unequivocal success. Saigon, and with it, South Vietnam, fell to northern invaders on April 30, 1975. The two Vietnams formally united the following July.
It's a mood ring. It tells what mood I'm in. It doesn't work. It always says black. It's only black when you're around because you put me in a bad mood.
In 1975, inventors Joshua Reynolds and Maris Ambatz hit the market with their new product, the mood ring. If you were unsure of how you felt or wanted to broadcast your emotions to those around you by means other than words, facial expressions, or even gestures, the mood ring would change color based on your emotional state. Be it happy purple, excited yellow, or anxious brown, the stone would reflect your inner feelings. Mood rings weren't magical, but they were cool, or at least based on marginally interesting science. The stones in the mood rings were made of glass or quartz filled with a kind of liquid crystal that changed color based on temperature. And of course, the temperature of the stone would theoretically track the temperature of the hand wearing it. So when blood flow changed as a result of an emotion, the temperature of the crystal would too, changing its color. While there's a gem of truth here, no one has been able to clearly map colors to mental states, but they have adapted similar technology for lipstick and nail polish. In 2025, Pantone announced Mocha Mousse as its color of the year. Mocha Mousse is a mid-cocoa shade that, despite its newly bestowed hipness, would have been right at home in American design in the mid-1970s, because the 70s were brown. There were golds and oranges and other earth tones, and occasionally the relatively vivid avocado green punched up the palette, but the Nixon years were in general brown as a paper bag, with decor and upholstery matching the natural materials like wood and rattan that were then in vogue. You could even eat off brown plates if you found that appetizing. Lest you be drawing a sigh of relief that, whatever new problems the future may be about to throw at us, at least we won't have to confront it from the design equivalent of a pile of dead leaves. Be warned. No less authority than Vogue has declared that brown is back in town and down to clown, or like they said back in the day, down to boogie. If fuel burns too quickly in a combustion engine, it can lead to poor performance, as well as an irritating noise known as engine knock. You can limit or prevent this issue by adding things to the fuel mixture. Unfortunately, one of the first additives widely used for this purpose was tetraethyl lead, which led to high levels of lead pollution throughout the industrialized world. The United States began phasing out leaded gasoline in 1972, and Europe soon followed. But lead additives persist in some types of jet fuel. Lead is very poisonous, especially for young children, and symptoms can be vague enough to mask the damage indefinitely despite its long-term effects. Lead has even been blamed for crime. Studies have connected the kind of brain damage lead can cause to the frontal cortex with aggression and personality changes. Some researchers even point to the surge of serial killers in the 70s and falling crime rates from the 90s as evidence that lead poisoning drove some antisocial behaviors. As Pulitzer-winning crime writer Caroline Fraser pithily put it in an interview with Time, more lead, more murder. One of the most optimistic food fads of the 70s was the pineapple diet, or to use its full name, the sexy pineapple diet. Published as a book in 1970 by Danish psychologist Sten Hegler and his wife Inga, the diet prescribed 2 days a week of an all or nearly all pineapple diet. You were allowed to supplement it with under 500 calories worth of other foods. The other 5 days a week, you could eat normally. Neither Hegler was a dietitian or anything else that would qualify them to design an eating regimen. Dr. Hegler just really liked pineapple. He also had no qualms about promoting its near-obsessive consumption to help people allegedly lose weight, feel healthier, and achieve greater sexual vitality. The book is out of print, but in 2017, a writer for Vice Denmark found a secondhand copy and gave it a whirl. He lost 2 pounds of water weight off his 6'6" frame and reported being too tired to feel especially sexually vital. That's because it sounds more like a starvation diet, and sorta is. Starting in the 50s, menswear had slowly become bolder in terms of both cut and color, veering away from the stereotypical gray suit of the sober businessman. This peacock revolution flowered in the 70s when new fabrics, patterns, and shapes transformed the classic suit and the rest of men's fashion. The ideal shaggy-haired 70s dude had a tall, lean silhouette, so cuts tended to emphasize those features and those lucky enough to have been born with them. Tight clothes emphasized slenderness, and the wide lapels and narrow neckties were designed to make the upper torso appear wider and more masculine. The 60s bell-bottom evolved into the slightly less exaggerated flared pant leg. The most iconic menswear item of the decade was probably the leisure suit, an often light or brightly colored suit in a synthetic fabric. History was not kind to the leisure suits, which often seemed cheap or tacky, and often was. If you don't know what the pencil test is, you weren't a woman or girl trying to navigate the fashions and sexual politics of the 70s. At the time, some women were choosing to go braless, while others occupied themselves with commenting on what those women should do with their own bodies.
I cannot wait to take it off.
Yeah. Welcome to womanhood.
The discussion even made it into one of the key public forums of the day, Ann Landers' column. On December 27, 1971, Landers published a compendium of letters for or against the brassiere, including one that explained the now famous pencil test. According to the letter writer, who signed her name One Who Flunked, a woman unsure if she should go without a bra should take a common pencil and place it under one breast. If it falls, the choice is hers. If the breast is able to hold the pencil against the wall of the body without falling, the tester fails, or passes depending on your taste, and should opt for a bra. And should the lady be able to not only keep the pencil in place but also write with it, she may also have options in show business. The 70s saw the rise of the much-beloved, much-derided dance music genre known as disco. Unofficially inaugurated with Gloria Gaynor's Never Can Say Goodbye in 1974, disco especially appealed to LGBTQ people and people of color, and arguably that just helped the trendy nature of it. Disco evolved from an open secret at the dance clubs of the day to the genre that ruled the airwaves in the 1970s, with artists around the world releasing disco tracks. The mania became so intense that even Broadway legend and grand old belter Ethel Merman herself put out a disco album, which has to be heard to be believed. But gimmicks like this and the associated reputation for commercialization helped sour the broader public on disco. In short, disco got old real quick. In July 1979, a baseball game between the Detroit Tigers and Chicago White Sox offered cheaper tickets to anyone who brought disco records to be destroyed in an on-field event called Disco Demolition Night. In other words, they were going to blow up all those records. The organizers went heavy with the dynamite, blowing a hole in the field, starting a riot, and causing the White Sox to forfeit the game. Disco has survived in the public consciousness at least. Gloria Gaynor won the 1980 Disco Grammy for the iconic I Will Survive, but that was the first and last year that category was awarded. If you were feeling wound up in the 60s or 70s, there was no need to bother your doctor about it. Just head to the stress clinic and pick up a prescription of some Quaaludes. Methaqualone had first been synthesized in 1951, and by the early 60s, it was in widespread use in the US as an effective tranquilizer. Quaaludes rode a wave of sedative prescriptions in post-war America when stressed-out people realized that they were but a pill away from feeling better. Quaaludes had a reputation for being easy to tolerate, and since a key ingredient was unpatented, anyone who happened to have a fully stocked pharmaceutical laboratory could produce them. Quaaludes eventually became so synonymous with recreational use that they earned the enticing nickname Disco Biscuits. The inhibition-lowering drug featured in songs by David Bowie and other musicians of the era, but its potential for accidental fatal overdose at last caught the attention of regulators. In 1984, methaqualone was officially outlawed in the United States. One generation's luxury so easily becomes another generation's punchline, and few consumer goods encapsulate this phenomenon more fully than shag carpet. The long fiber deep pile carpet, which at its extreme had a grassland-like ability to conceal an entire human foot, came into fashion in the 60s, and by the 70s it had spread over interiors from sea to shining sea. Available in a variety of fabrics and all the dubious colors of the era, shaggy shag was where it was at. Speaking to apartment therapy, design historian Sarah Lichtman connects the popularity of shag carpeting to two 70s trends: social change and unrest that may have driven people to want cozier interiors, plus a sexy sensuality that prioritized the tactile quality of surfaces. Shag carpet was a nightmare to clean, and it was such a specific look that it very easily became dated. The maximalist, pretentious 80s tossed the shag into the dumpster to make way for gleaming faux marble floors and never looked back. It's difficult to imagine now, but the 1896 US presidential election turned largely on whether US currency should be totally backed by gold reserves. Pro-gold Republican candidate William McKinley won, signing legislation to place the United States on a gold standard in 1900. US money continued to be backed by gold through World War I, and FDR maintained a modified gold standard through the Great Depression via some legal gymnastics involving confiscating all investment gold held by private citizens in 1933. After World War II, the dollar emerged as a mechanism for other countries to stabilize their currencies. Since the dollar was backed by gold, other countries could buy and sell good as gold US dollars when they needed to adjust their accounting. If you had $35 in US dollars, you could theoretically show up at the US reserves, trade them in, and get an ounce of gold plopped into your hot little hand. This worked until the US overprinted money to cover expanding social programs and the ballooning cost of the Vietnam War, meaning its gold reserves could no longer cover the dollars in circulation.
Let me lay to rest the bugaboo of what is called devaluation.
In 1971, President Richard Nixon ended the dollar's convertibility with gold. Gerald Ford repealed the ban on private citizens holding gold in 1974, and today the idea of returning to the gold standard is brought up occasionally by anti-inflation advocates who find themselves with no plans on a Friday night. History is full of crazy weight loss devices, but the craziest might be the vibrating belt workout machine, which was supposed to jiggle the fat off while you just stood there. According to the Orange County Register, the vibrating belt machine was a must-have device in fitness centers for decades, although most health experts knew they were essentially useless. Still, people have continued to find variations on this device rather irresistible over the years.
Introducing the revolutionary Vibro Action Belt. Just turn it on and it will literally vibrate the fat away from your abs.
Deep down, people really want to believe there's some magical technique that will help us drop those extra pounds without having to focus on diet and regular exercise. 50 years ago, people thought seatbelts were annoying and oppressive. In fact, most people didn't even want them in their cars. According to Second Chance Garage, customers were so fed up with seatbelts by 1949 that many people would actually cut them out of their cars with razor blades. By the early 1960s, seatbelts were offered as optional equipment on the vast majority of American cars, but that didn't really change anything. Most people simply didn't want them, and even people who had them in their cars tended not to use them. By 1966, only about 30% of the cars on the road in America had seatbelts, and approximately 44% of the people driving those cars used them full-time. In 1968, the powers that be finally passed a law requiring seatbelts as standard equipment in all cars, but that didn't really change anything. This wasn't just because people didn't like the idea of seatbelts. Reportedly, some auto manufacturers were accused of designing the belts to be uncomfortable, as sort of a nose-thumb to government regulations. That persistent hostility was largely the reason it took so long for anyone to actually pass real laws. The first mandatory seatbelt law didn't reach the books until the mid-1980s, and that was only in New York at first. As the New York Times reported on December 1, 1984, New York State's mandatory seatbelt law, the first in the nation, went into effect today. Drivers and front seat passengers must wear seatbelts or face fines up to $50.
Fasten your seatbelt, please.
Throughout the 60s, teenage girls were spoon-fed some terrible advice. In 1967, 17 published a whole book of etiquette entitled The 17 Book of Fashion and Beauty, which advised young women that good speech is more important than the actual words you say. The sound, the smile, the gentleness, warmth, and vitality. The voice that says, I like people, I like you. Meanwhile, the book also offered this not-so-cheerful tip. If a girl slumps her shoulders, it's a safe bet she hopes nobody will notice anything about her. Probably nobody will. Women in the 1960s were basically expected to be subservient to their husbands.
Oh, this coffee is criminal.
Honey, you killed the petunias.
According to Little Things, women could refer to a number of manuals in order to clarify whose needs came first. Spoiler alert, the needs of the husband came first.
Try the coffee.
Coffee? Oh, your coffee's always a real treat.
For example, Housekeeping Monthly's article, The Good Wife's Guide, instructed women to have a delicious meal ready on time for your husband's return. Also, the article suggested that women should always touch up your makeup, put a ribbon in your hair, and be fresh looking. Meanwhile, the article assured that catering for his comfort will provide you with immense personal satisfaction. In conclusion, yikes.
Harold, is the coffee all right?
Mm-mm.
You mean it's as bad as yesterday?
Mm-hmm.
Pregnancy can cause all kinds of weird body problems, and that includes constipation.
And if I don't ever poop again, well, that's just going to be who I am.
Today, you have to eat healthy or possibly take a fiber supplement to relieve discomfort. But 50 years ago, doctors didn't bother with any of that healthy lifestyle mumbo jumbo. Instead, they advised pregnant women to smoke cigarettes. Alan F. Guttmacher, a legit gynecologist and obstetrician, said as much in his book, Pregnancy and Birth. On top of that, he also said, there is no logical reason to prohibit the moderate use of alcohol during pregnancy to the patient who enjoys and tolerates it. The biggest thing Guttmacher wanted moms to avoid was unsightly weight gain, which he wanted to be limited to 20 pounds. And if an expectant mom was starting to get heavy, try skipping lunch and substitute skimmed milk with a few unsalted crackers. Nothing is more important than keeping your hot pregnant bod, right? Just another reason to keep up your smoking habits before your baby bump gets out of control. So if you were born in the late 60s and came out a little weird, you probably have this guy to blame. After pumping your baby full of more cigarettes and booze than Tom Waits, what else can you do to your kid to make them a good, healthy American? According to Dr. Walter W. Sackett Jr., the very first thing you should worry about after giving birth was the spread of communism. In his 1962 book, Bringing Up Babies, Sackett felt that breast milk or formula weren't enough for a newborn, so babies should start eating cereal within 2 days of escaping the womb. By 9 weeks, a baby should be able to chow down on whatever else the family would normally eat, which was apparently mostly booze, cigarettes, and anything that would fit into one of those newfangled microwaves. Sackett wasn't completely crazy. He did recommend waiting until a baby was 6 months old before starting with black coffee. And when your baby cries at night, because its blood is basically 90% coffee now, don't even think about coddling it. Sackett insisted that a baby had to learn to suffer, and soothing a crying baby was, very literally, sowing the seeds of socialism. With one lullaby, you can throw off the global balance of power, and everyone knows that in communist Russia, baby has you. Even though video games are a multi-billion-dollar industry today and heroic fat plumbers have become global phenomenon, the seeds of the industry didn't even exist until 1967. That was when Ralph Baer assembled a prototype for the first home game system. Baer worked for a TV company, and though he tried to sell them on the idea of including a game system with their televisions, all but one of his bosses was dismissive. Video games seemed pretty stupid to most of the executives, though he got a little money to produce a prototype. After all, who'd want to play a game on a TV when you had all the thrills of Monkey's Uncle?
You're a monkey's uncle. It's wild! Complete with stunt mats, cards, horns, clickers, tricks, spinner, and monkey timer.
Patents were filed by 1971, and the device was sold to Magnavox, who sold it as the Odyssey. Unfortunately, by the time the system debuted, Atari's Pong stole all their glory, making headway through the taboo against TV gaming, which would totally never ever become popular. Psychiatrist Walter Freeman thought he came across a life-changing medical procedure when he did his first ice pick lobotomy in 1946. See, Freeman figured that depression and mood problems were caused by having too much emotion, so he wanted to cut the emotional connection in the brain, literally. So, if you were feeling a little crazy, he took a metal rod and gently jammed it through your eye socket into your brain while you were still awake. If that sounds like a Mortal Kombat fatality, well, it's not too far off. For obvious reasons, people did tend to be much calmer or changed after the procedure, as anyone would be when they're left paralyzed or mentally disabled from a traumatic brain injury. Because there were so few reliable sources and medications available for the mentally ill at the time, it seemed like a great idea. Freeman traveled the country in a van he called the Lobotomobile, and even though an alarming proportion of his patients died along the way, that didn't stop people from coming. This went on until 1967, when he performed a lobotomy on a housewife who later died of a brain hemorrhage. That's when it was finally decided that he'd killed just a few too many people. He was forced to stop poking people's brains, and while lobotomies are still practiced today, they're done a little more carefully. Just make sure your doctor isn't named Scorpion or something. Laser technology was only just developing 50 years ago, and a lot of what was predicted in the 1967 documentary, The Laser, A Light Fantastic, actually came true. We're now regularly using lasers for surgery and tattoo removal just as predicted.
Laser surgery is still highly experimental. By the 21st century, a searing beam of laser light may join the scalpel as an essential surgical tool.
But they got one thing very, very wrong. In the late 60s, investors assumed that they'd need something to tackle the major epidemic of typewriter typos. The answer? Lasers. Like the world's most boring sci-fi ray gun, the functional laser eraser would kind of blast a single letter right off the face of a piece of paper without damaging the paper itself. Understandably, this was a pretty big deal when people actually typed stuff with ink instead of pixels. Lasers work their magic, and before you know it, it's like your dumb floppy fingers never even typed that extra E in the first place.
By golly, it works.
It does. All we need to do is miniaturize it and
get it into mass production.
Your lowly secretarial job is saved, and it only took 10 minutes and harnessing the most advanced technology that the 60s had to offer. Thanks, lasers.